Right. That Deputy Roland Merck pulled Sergeant Nadia Osei over. He saw exactly what he wanted to see: a black woman in wrinkled scrubs behind the wheel of an SUV. He didn't recognize driving slow through Caldwell Heights at 11:40 on a Thursday. He didn't see the Navy Cross tucked inside her medical bag. He didn't see the citation that read conspicuous gallantry under direct enemy fire. He didn't see the woman who had carried 3 bleeding Marines through a collapsing building in Kandahar while bullets were still coming through the walls. He just saw someone who didn't belong, and he decided to make sure she knew it. If this story already has your attention, stay with me until the very end, because what happens next will shake you. If this moved you, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. The rain had been falling since sundown, one of those cold, thin mid-October rains that didn't make any noise but soaked through everything anyway. Nadia Osei had her hypers on the lowest setting, barely keeping up, and she was driving with one hand on the wheel and the other pressed flat against her left thigh, where a muscle cramp had been building since hour 6 of a 12-hour shift. She'd been on her feet most of that time. She hadn't eaten a full meal since 7 in the morning. The granola bar in her center console was the closest thing she'd had to dinner, and she hadn't finished it. She took the cut-through on Sycamore Branch Road, not because she was trying to avoid anything. She took it because she always took it. It shaved 8 minutes off her drive home and bypassed 2 construction lights on the main road. She'd been taking that route for nearly 3 years, ever since she moved to the east side of Morrow Falls and started working nights at Hargrove Medical Center. It was a habit unremarkable and consistent, the kind of small ritual that working people build into their days without thinking. Well, Heights was quiet. At that hour, the houses were set back from the road, most of them dark, a few with porch lights burning. Sidewalks were empty. A dog barked somewhere deep in somebody's backyard and then stopped. Nadia noticed none of it specifically. Now she was running through her shift, in the back of her mind the 32-year-old with the ruptured appendix they'd caught just in time. The pediatric case that had made the whole floor tense up for 2 hours before stabilizing the argument she'd had with Dr. Otherstone about a medication dosage that she'd been right about, and he'd eventually conceded after making her lay out every piece of evidence twice. She was tired in that particular bone-deep way that doesn't knock you out so much as hollow you out. She wanted a hot shower in her couch. The lights appeared in her rear-view mirror without warning white, then the rolling red and blue. Just the lights. Nadia's first thought was that something was wrong with her car. A brake light, maybe. She checked her speed out of reflex, 28 in a 30. She pulled over, cleanly cut her engine, and reached for her wallet. Unhurried. She'd been stopped before. She knew what the process was. The deputy took his time walking up. She could see him in the side mirror, heavy-set hat low against the rain, no particular urgency in his stride. He reached her window and stood there for a moment before she rolled it down. Evening, she said. He didn't return it, then slowly moved his eyes around the interior of the car, behind the medical bag in the passenger seat, the Hargrove ID badge clipped to her visor, in the travel mug, and the cup holder, license and registration, he said. She handed them over. He took them without looking at her. Where are you coming from? Work, Hargrove Medical. I'm a nurse, their trauma unit. He looked at the registration, looked at her license, looked at neither one for long enough to actually read them. What are you doing in this neighborhood? Nadia kept her hands on the steering wheel. Taking my usual route home. I live on the east side over on Delhart. I cut through Sycamore Branch every night. Every night, he repeated, like she'd said something he didn't believe. That's right. He was quiet for a moment. Behind him, she could see a second deputy standing near the cruiser. Hunger, she thought. He wasn't approaching, just watching. We've had some break-ins in this area, Merck said. People been keeping an eye out. Nadia didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. Step out of the vehicle. Can I ask why step out of the vehicle, ma'am? She got out slowly, deliberately, keeping her hands where he could see them without being theatrical about it. The rain hit her face and her shoulders, and immediately started soaking through her scrubs. She stood on the wet asphalt and looked at him directly. Sergeant Nadia Osei, she said, United States Navy, honorably discharged. I'm a trauma nurse at Hargrove Medical. I've been on shift since 11 this morning. Merck looked at her the way people look at something they've already decided about. Military ID not on me. No, I'm not active duty. My credentials are in my bag. My hospital badge is on the visor. Hospital. Badge doesn't tell me much, he said. The younger deputy had come up on the other side of the car now, close to the passenger window, and he was looking at the medical bag. He was maybe mid-20s, something uncomfortable in the set of his shoulders, like he wasn't sure what the right position was to stand in. Merck walked around to the passenger side and opened the door. "That's my equipment," Nadia said. She'd moved around the front of the car without thinking, and she stopped herself. "That's my medical bag. I'm going to take a look." "You don't have consent to search my vehicle." Merck looked at her over the roof of the car. Something shifted in his expression, not anger exactly, more like a decision being made. "I'm not asking for consent. I'm telling you. I'm going to take a look." "That's an illegal search," the younger deputy said quietly. "Roland, back." From the vehicle, Merck said to her, ignoring his partner entirely. She stepped back. She measured her breathing. She'd been in rooms where the air was full of smoke, and the temperature was 120 and people were dying around her, and she had not lost her composure, not once. She was not going to lose it now, but her jaw was tight and her hands were shaking slightly, and not from the cold. Unzipped the bag and started going through it with no particular care. Supplies. An emergency airway kit, a pair of surgical scissors with orange handles, a tourniquet, gloves. At the bottom, wrapped in a small cloth, a silver case she had carried with her for going on 6 years everywhere she went, because she didn't know what else to do with it. Some people put their medals in a shadow box on the wall. Nadia had never gotten around to doing that, or maybe she just wasn't ready to leave it behind in a house while she went somewhere else. Picked up the case, opened it. Inside, the Navy Cross sat on a dark lining, the blue and white ribbon still clean, the metal face showing the anchor and the eagle. Next to it, the Marine Corps Commendation Medal, and beneath both folded once the citation paper that explained what had been done to earn them. Huck looked at it for a moment. Then he made a sound, not quite a laugh, but close. A costume piece. Nadia's voice came out completely level. "That is a Navy Cross and a Marine Corps Commendation Medal. If you'll read the citation, where'd you get this?" "I earned it. Kandahar Province, 2019. I was attached to the 3rd Marine Battalion as a combat medic." And he set the case down on the seat without closing it. "A Navy Cross. Yes. And you're a trauma nurse at Hargrove." "Yes." "Who takes a cut-through? She's always taken through a neighborhood with an active burglary investigation at midnight." 11:40, she said. And yes, he looked at her for a long moment. The younger deputy behind him now had stopped moving entirely. His arms were crossed, and he was looking at the wet pavement. I'm going to need you to turn around and put your hands on the vehicle." "Why are you arresting me?" "Suspicious activity. Failure to comply with a lawful order." "I complied with every order, and obstruction of a lawful search." "Conducted an illegal search. I didn't obstruct anything." I verbally objected. "That's my legal right." Merck stepped toward her, and she turned without another word and put her hands on the hood. Not because she was agreeing. Not because she was defeated. Because she was making a calculation, one she'd learned in places far more dangerous than a wet road in Caldwell Heights, about when fighting physically made things better, and when it made them catastrophically worse. She put her hands on the hood and felt the cold metal against her palms, and listened to the cuff click around her left wrist. Her medical equipment was already spread across the passenger seat, and part of the road where he'd laid things out. The Navy Cross was sitting open in the rain. The younger deputy was named Grayson Pruitt. He'd been working with Merck for 14 months, which was long enough to have seen things he hadn't said anything about, and short enough that he was still telling himself that wasn't exactly what it looked like. He walked over to where the silver case was and closed it carefully and put it back in the bag. He didn't say anything. He couldn't find anything to say that would come out right. Nadia noticed what he did. She didn't acknowledge it, but she noticed. They brought her into the Redmont County Sheriff's substation on Fulton Lane at 12:23 in the morning. Wrote his report at a desk while she sat in a holding room that smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee. The room had one window barred that looked out on a parking structure. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed at a pitch that would eventually give anyone a headache. She'd had worse rooms. That wasn't the point. The point was the report being written 20 feet away. She'd seen the way Merck moved through the stop, the casual authority that had nothing to do with actual confidence. The way he'd talked over her, the little performances of disbelief you earned a Navy Cross right, designed to put her in a position where anything she said sounded like it needed defending. She knew what a falsified report looked like in practice. Theoretically, she'd testified in proceeding where those reports had been introduced. She knew exactly what was being written in that room. She sat with her cuffed hands in her lap and ran the night back through her mind, clinical and precise the way she thought, through a patient presentation. What had been observed? What had been said? What was on the body cameras? Because both deputies had been wearing them, and she'd kept track of her own words carefully enough that the footage would show something very specific. Right. She thought about the silver case sitting open in the rain until Grayson Pruitt closed it. She thought about what she needed and what she had and what the next move was. When the deputy at the desk told her she had a phone call, she stood, walked to the phone, and dialed from memory. 4 times. She counted them. The voice that answered was unhurried, slightly rough from sleep. The voice of a man who'd learned a long time ago not to sound alarmed by a late phone call. "See," she said. "I'm sorry for the time. I need to tell you where I am. Brigadier General Elliot Holt, 1-star, retired 18 months. Now heading a veterans advocacy office out of Arlington, had known Nadia Osei since she was a 26-year-old Navy corpsman. He'd watched refuse a direct order to fall back because she wasn't finished getting her people out. He'd written 2 of her commendations himself. He'd been at the ceremony in Camp Lejeune where they gave her the Navy Cross, and she'd shaken the presenting officer's hand with a dislocated finger she hadn't told anyone about because she hadn't wanted anyone fussing with the schedule. He listened to what she told him without interrupting. When she was done, there was a pause. "Are you hurt?" "Nothing serious." "Did they document an injury?" "No." Another pause. "Then I'll make some calls. Don't say anything else tonight." To anyone in that building understood Nadia. "Sir, I'm going to need you to be patient for the next couple of hours." I was patient through the whole stop. There was the briefest exhale on his end. "I know you were." She handed the phone back and returned to the holding room and sat down and was patient. What happened over the next 90 minutes happened mostly in rooms she wasn't in. Despite being a brigadier general rather than the 4-star, he'd sometimes been described as he was precise about rank, because he'd spent his life earning it, knew enough people in the right positions to make a set of phone calls that moved. Through several layers of military and federal contact before arriving somewhere that mattered. He also made a call to a legal aid organization that specialized in civil rights cases involving veterans, and the attorney who picked up that call was at her desk within the hour, even though it was almost 2 in the morning. Her name was Celeste Wakeman, and she had the specific quiet energy of someone who had been waiting for this exact type of call. Nadia was still sitting in the holding room when the building's main entrance made a sound. She recognized the sound of people arriving who expected doors to open for them, and doors. She didn't move. She just listened to the change in the ambient noise of the station, the sudden quiet that fell over what had been low desk noise and radio chatter, the footsteps that moved differently than department footsteps moved. Buck had been at his desk. He stood up when the door opened, and then he didn't sit back down. Brigadier General Elliot Holt was 61 years old, gray-headed, with a face like a geological feature, the kind of face that time had compressed rather than softened. He was in dress uniform because he'd known making his calls that this was not a situation where civilian clothes would carry the appropriate weight, and he'd made the calculation deliberately and without sentimentality. Behind him came Celeste Wakeman with a leather briefcase and a look of absolute professional focus, and behind her 2 individuals who were not in uniform, but whose bearing made it clear they weren't there to be ignored. Holt scanned the room once, found the station commander, a broad-shouldered man named Captain Altenfitch, who'd been woken up 40 minutes earlier and had the look of someone who was still assembling the full picture, and walked toward him. "I'm looking for Sergeant Nadia Osei," Holt said, "discharged United States Navy." "Was told she's being held here." Fitch straightened. "General, she's where is she?" It wasn't a question. They brought Nadia out of the holding room and into the main area, and for a moment she and Holt just looked at each other. She had a bruise forming on her left wrist where the cuff had been cinched too tight. He saw it immediately. His expression didn't change on the surface, but something in his posture did, a very slight, very contained settling, like a structure that had just decided where its weight was going. He raised his right hand and saluted her. The room went completely still. It was a full formal salute, chin-level, elbow-aligned, the kind that doesn't leave room for interpretation. He held it until she returned it, and then he lowered his hand and said quietly, with his back to the rest of the room, "You all right?" "Yes." "Your bag and evidence. We'll get it." "Yes." Wakeman had already moved to the desk and was speaking in a low, rapid, impeccably controlled voice to the deputy, who was handling the paperwork. She had a copy of Nadia's active hospital credentials, her D-214, and what appeared to be a prepared brief, as if she'd been expecting exactly this case and had simply been waiting for the address. Merck was standing near his desk, with it an expression that had passed through several phases in the last 4 minutes, and had arrived somewhere between defensive and calculating, the look of a man who had not yet admitted to himself that he'd made a serious error, but who understood that the situation had changed in a way that required a new strategy. He said to no one in particular, "I had reasonable suspicion." She was in an area under investigation, and she refused to contact. Holt, his voice was entirely calm. "I'd recommend stopping that sentence." Merck stopped. Captain Fitch cleared his throat. "General, if I could explain the circumstances." "I'd like to see the body camera footage," Holt said, from both deputies on the stop. Tonight, Fitch hesitated for 2 seconds. "That takes a formal request through tonight," Holt said. Wakeman placed a document on the desk in front of the captain. "That's the formal request. She's saying time-stamped, filed electronically 8 minutes ago. I've already received it." Fitch looked down at it. He looked like a man who'd stepped on ice and was deciding whether to shift his weight or stand very still. Across the room, Grayson Pruitting at a secondary desk, since they'd come back from the stop. He hadn't gone home, hadn't found anything useful to do, just sat there with his coffee going cold, running the night over in his head in a way that wasn't resolving into anything comfortable. He'd done nothing tonight that could be filed as a misconduct violation. He'd also done almost nothing that he felt good about. He stood up now and said to the room in general, "I can pull the footage." Everyone looked at him. "Steadier, I can pull it." I know where it's cued, I'll get it up on the monitor." Turned to look at him with something dark moving behind his eyes. Pruitt didn't look back. He walked to the terminal and started pulling the files. The footage came up on the main monitor in a conference room off the main floor. Both cameras synchronized the quality grainy but clear enough. Everyone who needed to be in the room was in the room. Holt, Wakeman, Fitch, Nadia herself, 2 other department personnel. Stood in the doorway. They watched the stop from the beginning. The pullover. The license and registration, Nadia's voice, clear and steady, identifying herself. The moment Merck reached into the passenger side and unzipped the bag. Nadia said, "You don't have consent to search my vehicle." And Merck continued anyway. The moment he picked up the silver case and made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh and asked, "This a costume piece?" The room was very quiet. They watched the cuffs go on. Watched Merck's report of the stop narrated into his body camera afterward. In the car, the version where she had refused to exit the vehicle, the version where she had become combative, the version where the search had been invited. None of it matched what was on screen. Nadia had watched the footage with her hands flat on the table and her face completely controlled. She knew what the footage showed. She had constructed the entire interaction knowing the cameras were running, which was why she'd been so careful with every word, every movement, every point of compliance. It was not the first time she had operated under conditions where how she performed would determine consequences she had no other way to control. Wakeman reached over and paused the footage. "The search began at 11:47, she said. The grounds stated in Deputy Merck's report are elevated suspicion based on furtive movements and failure to comply. The footage shows no furtive movements and full compliance to that point. The search was conducted without consent and without probable cause." She looked at Fitch. "There are 2 separate federal statutes this implicates." To discuss next steps. Fitch put his hand over his mouth. He looked at Merck in the doorway. Merck said, "There's context that the camera doesn't." "Stop talking," Fitch said. It was the first time Nadia had heard him say anything with any real authority behind it, and she noted it without expression. Fitch said, "Deputy Merck, you're going to the interview room. Now, your weapon and badge stay with me until we've sorted this out." He looked at Pruitt, who was standing just behind Merck. "You're a witness. You don't go anywhere either." Pruitt nodded. He looked at that moment like someone who had made a decision a while ago and was only now experiencing what it felt like to actually act on it. Then Wakeman said something else quietly to General Holt, and Holt's expression shifted just slightly, not in a way that the room would catch, but Nadia caught it, because she knew his face, and she knew what the different calibrations of his reactions meant. She looked at Wakeman. She said. Wakeman hesitated, then turned the laptop screen toward her. She'd run a search during the footage review, a standard background check on the deputy's prior activity, complaints filed, cases, flagged, internal review records, accessible under the state's recent transparency statute. The pattern that came up wasn't subtle. Over the past 4 years, Roland Merck had accumulated 11 use-of-force complaints, 7 of which had been administratively closed without investigation. 8 separate individuals had filed reports, alleging unlawful vehicle searches during traffic stops in Caldwell Heights and the surrounding districts. Three of those had gone to the county's internal review board and been dismissed for insufficient evidence. The demographics of every complainant, without exception, were the same. Nadia looked at the screen for a long time. Then she looked up at General Holt and said very quietly, "This wasn't about me." Holt said nothing. "He didn't need to," she said. "It was never about the burglary investigation. That was just the current justification. He's been doing this for years and someone has been closing the cases." Aikman said, "That's what the record suggests. Who has oversight of the complaint review board?" "Sheriff's office." "And the sheriff is?" "Malcolm Teague," Fitch said from behind them. He'd come up without any of them noticing. He was looking at the screen with an expression she couldn't quite place, somewhere between resignation and something that might have been relief. The look of a man who'd been waiting for a bottom to arrive so he could stop bracing for it. "And yes, I know what you're about to say and you're not wrong." The station held that weight for a moment, the specific airless weight of a large thing that has just become visible. Outside, the rain was still falling in the parking lot. One of the vehicles that had arrived with Holt sat with its engine running quiet and dark. Nadia's wrist was still bruised. Her equipment was still in an evidence bag. Her charges had not yet been formally dropped, and that process would take hours more and involve more documents and more careful language than it should have. In a monitor room off the main floor of the Redmont County Sheriff's substation on Fulton Lane, a file was open on a screen, and Celeste Wakeman was typing. And General Elliot Holt was standing with his arms behind his back, looking out a window at the parking lot, and the night had shifted into something that wasn't going to close quietly. Nadia sat in a chair with her hands folded in her lap and said nothing. She had a long practice of waiting in rooms where decisions were being made that would affect her, and doing it without telegraphing anything. And being still in the way that people who have operated in actual danger are still not defeated, not resigned, but calibrated, conserving something. The footage was still running on the monitor in the background. On the screen, in the grainy timestamp of 11:47, Roland Merck was still holding a Navy cross and calling it a costume piece. And in the corner of that same frame, barely visible at the edge of the shot, Grayson Pruitt was closing the silver case against the rain. The footage kept running on the monitor in the background, and nobody turned it off. That was the thing Nadia noticed most in the hour that followed, that nobody in that building moved to stop the playback. It cycled through once, then started again from the beginning. The timestamp ticking up from 11:41, and people kept finding reasons to be in the doorway of that room, kept glancing at the screen, kept watching the same 46 minutes of footage, the way you watch something you need to fully believe before you can act on it. Deputy she didn't recognize stood in the hallway for a full 10 minutes with a coffee cup going cold in his hand, staring at the monitor, not saying anything. Wakeman was on her third phone call. She'd stepped out into the corridor and was speaking in that specific low register lawyers use when they want to be heard by the person on the line, and no one else, precise, unhurried, each sentence landing with the weight of something premeditated. Nadia caught fragments when the corridor swung open. Pattern of conduct. Documented complaints, footage is unambiguous. The door swung closed again. General Holt had moved to a chair across the table from Nadia and sat there with his hands folded, not performing patience, but actually having it, which was different and visible. He didn't talk much under pressure. She'd known that about him since Kandahar. He conserved words the way certain people conserve energy, not out of coldness, but out of a long understanding that words spent wrong in a charged room cost more than silence. "You need anything," he said. "I'm fine, your wrist. If it's bruised. I've had worse, I know you have." He paused. "That doesn't mean I can't ask." She looked at him. He was 61 and looked it in the fluorescent light, the kind of tired that accumulates over decades rather than nights. But his eyes were steady and direct in the way she'd always found steadying herself. He was not a man who needed things to be resolved immediately. He was a man who understood that some situations required you to sit in the discomfort of the unresolved and wait for the right moment to move. She said the complaint files, all 11 of them. "Do you know who specifically was signing off on the closures?" "Wakeman is working on that. Because it's not just Merck. You understand that Merck is the instrument. Someone was managing the instrument. I understand. If it stays focused on Merck, it stops there. Everything gets cleaned up neatly and the mechanism stays intact, and in 18 months some other version of this happens to someone else." Holt looked at her for a moment. "You're thinking about this very clearly for someone who's been awake for 17 hours and just got pulled off a road in handcuffs." I'm always thinking clearly," she said. "That's not arrogance. It's a condition." He almost smiled. Almost Captain Fitch came back into the room looking like he'd aged a specific measurable amount since they'd last seen him. He had a folder in one hand and the look of a man who'd found something in it that he hadn't wanted to find. He set the folder on the table and didn't sit down. We've got a problem, he said. Holt weighted the complaint files, the closed ones. 3 of them were signed off by the Internal Review Board, standard procedure. Other 4. He stopped open the folder. They were flagged for escalation to the sheriff's office and then administratively closed without review. 5. I've been trying to pull the chain of authorization. 2 of them don't have complete paperwork. The closure records are missing the required supervisor signature. How Wakeman said from the doorway, she'd come back in without anyone noticing. Documents are there. The signature fields are blank. Fitch looked up, which means someone closed them informally and either didn't complete the paperwork or someone pulled the signature pages after the fact. Nadia said, when were those 2 files closed? Fitch checked. 14 months ago and 9 months ago. And who was the reviewing supervisor at both those times? Fitch didn't answer immediately. Who was it? Holt said. Teeps said. Both times the room held that for a moment. Wakeman crossed to the table and picked up the folder and paged through it with the focused, rapid efficiency of someone who reads documents professionally and doesn't need to perform the act. I need copies of all of this tonight. I can't just act in. She looked at him over the folder. In approximately 4 hours, I'm going to be filing a federal complaint. If you want to be documented as someone who cooperated fully with an active investigation to civil rights violations and misconduct within your department, I need copies of everything in this folder tonight. If you'd prefer to be on the other side of that documentation, I can make that work too. Had the look of a man staring at 2 doors and understanding for the first time that they didn't lead to the same place. He took the folder back, looked at it, and said, give me 20 minutes. Wakeman sat down and opened her briefcase and pulled out a legal pad that was already half covered in her handwriting. She said to Nadia, without looking up, I need your account of the stop in as much detail as you can give me. Everything you said, everything he said, the sequence of physical events. I have the footage, but I need it in your words now. Now is better than 6 hours from now when you're exhausted and the details compress. So Nadia talked. She went through the stop in the order it happened. The lights in the mirror, the window rolling down, the license and registration, the questions about where she was coming from. The moment he'd walked around to the passenger side and put his hand on her bag. She was precise about language, what exact words he'd used, what exact words she'd used in response, the sequence of physical movements. She didn't editorialize. She gave Wakeman the architecture of the event and let it stand without commentary. Wakeman wrote without stopping partway through. Grayson Pruitt appeared in the doorway. He'd apparently been standing in the hallway for a while, trying to decide something. He looked young in a way that had nothing to do with age, the particular youngness of someone confronting the gap between what they thought they were and what the situation revealed. Can I talk to somebody? He said. Wakeman looked up. About the stop. About tonight and about other things. Alt stood and said, come in, sit down. Pruitt came in and sat down like a man who wasn't sure the chair would hold him. He put his hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. There were other stops, he said, that I was part of, ones I knew about. That I wasn't part of. Wakeman had her pen ready. Okay, she said. I kept telling myself it was that I didn't have enough to... He stopped, uttered again. I wrote it up once, a concern with my sergeant, 18 months ago. Merck had pulled this guy over on Beaumont, middle of the day, ran him through the whole thing, no justification. I put it in writing. He looked up. My sergeant told me to refile it as an informal concern rather than a formal complaint. It would be better handled that way. I filled it. What happened to it after that? I don't know. Nothing. I never heard anything back. Nadia was watching him. He had the specific discomfort of someone who had been moving toward this moment for a long time, without knowing it, who had been building a case against himself in the background of every shift, and was only now bringing it fully into the light. It wasn't comfortable to watch. It wasn't supposed to be. Sergeant's name. Wakeman said. Pruitt gave it. I want to cooperate, he said. Whatever this is. I want to be on record as cooperating. I know. I know how that sounds, but I need to be somewhere when this is over. Wakeman said, I understand. I'll need a full statement. Everything you observed, everything you reported, everything that was done with those reports, if possible. He nodded. He looked at Nadia once quickly, then away. She didn't help him with that. She didn't look away to make it easier. Let him sit with it. The next hour moved in layers. Fitch came back with copies of the complaint files, all of them, going back further than the 4 that had been flagged, going back to the beginning of Merck's record in the department. Wakeman sorted them in a way that suggested she already knew what pattern she was looking for and was now simply confirming its dimensions. 5. The pattern was not subtle once the files were laid out in sequence, escalating stops in specific geographic zonographics, complaints filed, complaints closed, supervisor signatures, or the absence of them. And buried underneath the administrative language, 14 individual people who had described nearly identical experiences to the ones visible on the body camera footage, playing on the monitor down the hall. At 3:40 in the morning, Nadia's charges were formally dropped. Fitch signed the paperwork himself and handed a copy to Wakeman and a copy to Nadia and said, "I'm sorry for the circumstances that led you here tonight." It was a careful sentence calibrated to acknowledge without fully admitting, but she accepted it for what it was and moved past it. Her medical bag was returned. She inventoried the contents methodically in front of the deputy handling evidence and documented what was present and what had been damaged when Merck pulled equipment out onto wet pavement. The Navy Cross case was intact. Pruitt had closed it against the rain, and somehow during processing it hadn't been opened again. She checked the metal itself, ran her thumb across the face, and put it back. Wakeman. When does the federal complaint go in? I'm filing as soon as I'm out of this building. The pattern is documented well enough to move immediately. They'll open a formal inquiry which triggers an automatic hold on any related internal review proceedings. Wakeman looked at her. Isn't going to be able to quietly resolve this internally. Teague, the unsigned closure records are a problem for him. If his office was managing which complaints got buried, he's directly implicated. That determination isn't mine to make. But the documentation is going to federal investigators tonight. Timeline. Honestly, these things take time, months, not days. Wakeman paused. I want to be straight with you about that. Tonight is important. It matters. But it's the beginning of a process, not the end of one. Nadia said, I know how these processes work. I know you do. And I'm not asking for fast. I'm asking for thorough. Fine. Then we're in agreement outside. The rain had stopped somewhere in the last hour without anyone noticing. Parking lot was slick and dark and quiet. Nadia stood at the main entrance of the substation and breathed the outside air for the first time since they'd brought her in, and it was cold and had that particular post-rain clarity, the smell of wet asphalt and something faintly mineral from the trees along Fulton Lane. Buck came up beside her. I'll drive you home, he said. I have my car. Your car is still on Sycamore Branch. Bucks will get someone to bring it. She didn't argue. She was tired in a way that had finally caught up to her. The adrenaline had metabolized and left the real exhaustion underneath. Hopkins, the kind that came from a long shift followed by an hour of calculated composure in a situation that had required every ounce of it. They drove in near silence. Holt sat in his own civilian, not government, and he drove it the way he did most things, methodically, without wasted motion. The streets of Morrow Falls at 4 in the morning were empty in a way that felt total, like the city had gone somewhere else. She said, you didn't have to come. I know. I told you I was fine. You were fine, and I still came. She looked out the window. The streetlights made long orange reflections on the wet road. You wrote my first commendation, she said. I know. You said I showed uncommon steadiness under conditions designed to break steadiness. He was quiet for a moment. I remember I was thinking about that tonight in the holding room. That phrase, she paused. I kept thinking this is a condition designed to break steadiness. I kept thinking I've been in worse ones. You have. That doesn't make it okay. No, he said. It absolutely doesn't. She was quiet for a while. Then he thought he could read the room in 10 seconds. He knew exactly what I was and what I wasn't, and what he could do without anyone caring. She wasn't bitter when she said it. Not exactly. It was more like noting a technical error, something that had been misdiagnosed. He was so certain he'll have time to reconsider that. I want more than reconsideration, she said. I want structural change. I want the mechanism that was protecting him to be taken apart. I want the people who were signing off on those closed complaints to be held specifically accountable, not just the man they were covering for. That's what Wakeman is building toward, I know. She turned away from the window. I just need to say it out loud sometimes. That wanting is not enough. I have to trust a process I can't control. Holt took a corner, carefully slowing before he needed to. That's not something I can fix for you. I know that too. They pulled up to her house, a small 2-story on Delhart with a porch light that she always left on when she worked. Not a habit she'd had, since she was stationed somewhere with a curfew and had kept without realizing why. Stopped the car and she gathered her bag. Get some sleep, he said. I have a shift in 7 hours. He started to say something, then stopped. Fine. No, she said, but if I don't go in, it means they took something from me that I'm not prepared to give. Nodded. He understood that logic. He'd operated on it himself more than once. Locked. She got out, went up her porch steps, unlocked the door. Hi. Before she went inside, she turned back. General. Take him. Which was lated. Thank you, she said, answering all he said. And then, because he was Elliot Holt and he was precise about things, get 2 hours at minimum. An alarm. She went inside. She put her bag on the kitchen table and sat down next to it and looked at nothing for a few minutes. The house was quiet and familiar, and she was alone in it in a way that felt briefly enormous, the decompression of coming down from a sustained state of alertness into ordinary domestic silence. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed on the street outside. She opened the silver case and looked at the Navy Cross for a moment. Looked at it. Then she closed it, took off her scrubs, and set her alarm. She got exactly 2 hours and 40 minutes of sleep before her phone rang. It was Wakeman. I need you to know something before you see it anywhere else, Wakeman said. The quality of her voice had changed, still controlled, but with an undercurrent of something sharp, something that suggested the board had shifted in a direction that hadn't been predicted. Nadia, what happened? The footage leaked. Still which footage? All of it, the full 46 minutes. Inside the station. We don't know who yet copied the body camera file, and it went out to 3 local news stations and a national outlet simultaneously. It's been running for the last 20 minutes. Nadia looked at the window. It was gray and early, barely light. How bad, she said. It's everywhere, Wakeman said, and Nadia, they caught the moment with the metal part, where he calls it a costume piece. That clip is 11 seconds long, and it's been shared 40,000 times in the last hour. She didn't say anything. Your name is public, Wakeman said. Your service record is public, the Navy Cross citation. All of it. Someone sent the documents to the same outlets. I didn't authorize that. I know I didn't either. Then, inside that building made a decision, a pause. The story is already framing you in ways I don't fully control. Some of it is accurate. Some of it is, Wakeman hesitated. There are angles being taken that I want you to be prepared for. Not everyone is going to tell this cleanly. Nadia pressed the heel of her hand against her forehead. Her wrist ached. Does Merck know it's out? His attorney called me 20 minutes ago. So yes, and Teague. There was a pause that told her everything before Wakeman said the words. Sheriff Teague held a press conference at 5:30 this morning, Wakeman said. He said the department is taking the complaint seriously and that Deputy Merck has been placed on administrative leave pending review. He called the stop a misunderstanding. He said the department has strong policies against misconduct. Another pause. He did not mention the closed complaint files. He did not mention the unsigned authorization records. Nadia stood up. He's getting ahead of it, she said. Yes. He's trying to control the frame before the federal filing lands. That's exactly what he's doing. Can we move the timeline up? I'm working on it. I made a call this morning to Wakeman. Stopped. I need you to come in. Not to the substation, to my office. I have something I need to show you in person. It involves the complaint files, specifically the closed ones. And there's a name that came up last night during Pruitt's statement that I've been cross-referencing, and it's... And she paused again in the way that people pause when they're choosing whether to say the full weight of a thing on a phone call or wait. Until they can watch someone's face when they say it. It's me. Tell me, Nadia said. It's bigger than Merck, Wakeman said. And it's bigger than Teague. Nadia was already reaching for her clothes. She was already reaching for her clothes when she stopped and made herself put the phone down on the bed and sit for 30 seconds and breathe, because she was panicking. She wasn't panicking. But she'd learned in Kandahar, and before that in field training, and before that in her mother's house, in a neighborhood where the difference between a good decision and a catastrophic one was often just the gap between reacting and thinking. She'd learned that the 30 seconds you spend before moving are sometimes the most important 30 seconds in the sequence. Wakeman had said it's bigger than Teague. That sentence needed to be metabolized, not just heard. She dressed quickly, drank half a glass of water standing at the kitchen sink, checked that the silver case was secured in her bag, and was out the door in 8 minutes. Wakeman's office was downtown on Creston Avenue, 4th floor of a building that housed 3 law practices and an accounting firm. At 6:20 in the morning, it was empty except for Wakeman herself and a paralegal named Doss, who looked like he'd also been awake all night and had made peace with it. Coffee was on. A second chair had been pulled up to Wakeman's desk. The desk was covered in paper in a way that looked disorganized until you got close and realized there was a system to it: complaint files in one stack, cross-reference documents in another. Lines. Something that looked like a departmental org chart printed on 3 taped-together sheets laid flat across the left side. Nadia stood at the edge of the desk and took it in. Eichmann said, "Sit down. Tell me the name first." Eichmann looked at her for a moment, then said, "Douglas Farwell." Nadia sat down. Douglas Farwell was not a name she recognized from inside the Redmont County Sheriff's Office. He wasn't a deputy or a sergeant or an internal review officer. She said, "So he's not department," Wakeman said. "He's county. Deputy county administrator. Specifically, he's been in that position for 11 years. Before he was with the county prosecutor's office. For 8, she slid a document across the desk, a printout of a county government organizational chart with a name circled in blue pen. Pruitt mentioned him last night in passing, talking about the refiling of his informal concern. He said his sergeant told him to refile it, and he used a phrase, 'The administrator's office already has a handle on this one.' I asked him what he meant. He assumed it was standard language, but I wrote it down, and when you cross-referenced, Farwell's name appears on 2 of the closed complaint files, not on the official documentation on an email chain that was included in the discovery materials from a completely separate civil case involving the department from 3 years ago. 5 was attached to a deposition and filed in county court records, which made it public, which meant I could pull it." She slid another document across. He was communicating directly with Teague's deputy chief about how to categorize 2 of the early complaints. Language is careful. It doesn't say bury this. It says, and I'm quoting, "These would be better handled through the standard administrative pathway rather than the formal review process." Nadia read the email chain. It was 2 exchanges. Briefed the language bureaucratic in the specific way that bureaucratic language is used to communicate things that can't be written plainly. She said standard administrative pathway means what exactly? Context. It means the pathway that ends at Teague's desk and goes nowhere else. 5. The formal review process would have required external oversight. The administrative pathway didn't. So Farwell was advising Teague on which complaints could be safely rerouted. That's how I read it. Why, what's his connection to Merck? Hickman pulled out a 3rd document. "This took me most of the night to find, and I'm still not certain it's complete. But Farwell's brother-in-law is a contractor. His company has had 3 county law enforcement contracts in the past 7 years, all awarded through the county administrator's office. 2 of those contracts were approved during Teague's tenure as sheriff. The 3rd was approved 6 months before the first closed complaint file." Nadia looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Merck wasn't just being protected because Teague liked him," she said. "Oh, he was being protected because the mechanism protecting him also protected something else. That's the structure I'm seeing. I think Merck was genuinely just Merck. I don't think he was aware of the financial layer. I think he was simply a deputy who had been doing something harmful for years and had learned that complaints against him disappeared and drew the operational conclusion from that. He was untouchable." Yes, Nadia put the documents down and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of her nose. Her head ached in the dull, compressed way that came from 2 hours of sleep and sustained cortisol. She thought about the 14 individuals in those files, 14 names attached to 14 experiences that had been categorized, rerouted, and administratively dissolved. She thought about Farwell's email, the careful language better handled through the standard pathway. She thought about how long the pathway had been running. "The federal complaint you filed this morning," she said. "Does it include Farwell?" "It mentions the email chain and flags it for investigative follow-up. The complaint is structured around the pattern of conduct and the documentation of the closures. I didn't want to overreach the evidence I can substantiate right now." Wakeman folded her hands on the desk. "The investigators will find Farwell. That's their function. My job is to make sure the case that's already built is airtight. And Teague's press conference this morning is already looking worse. The national outlet that received the footage last night ran the full story at 6 a.m. They have the Navy Cross citation. They have your service record. They interviewed 2 veterans advocacy groups." She paused. Teague called it a misunderstanding. "The clip of Merck calling your medal a costume piece has been shared 300,000 times. Nadia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's not good." Hickman raised an eyebrow. "Not for the reason you'd think," Nadia said. "When something goes that big that fast, it becomes about the clip. In seconds. The symbol is easier to manage than the structure." She looked at the org chart on the desk. He can take the PR hit on Merck. He can let Merck be the villain of the 11-second clip. He fires Merck, releases a strong statement, announces reforms, and the structural layer stays intact because everyone's focused on the symbol. Aikman was quiet. You're right, she said. A financial connection to Farwell has to be in the story, Nadia said. Not in a year. When the investigation concludes now, the attention is on it. I can't release investigative materials. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you whether there's a legitimate way to make sure the investigators understand the timeline pressure here. If this gets publicly framed as one bad deputy misguided oversight department taking corrective action, the federal investigation becomes harder to pursue because the public narrative has already resolved. Aikman looked at her for a long moment. You've thought about institutional behavior a lot. I've watched institutions protect themselves a lot. I have a specific professional background in that. Boss appeared in the doorway with a second cup of coffee and a look of someone trying to be invisible. Wakeman took the cup without breaking eye contact with Nadia. I'll make some, Wakeman said. Carefully, and within my professional constraints. I'll make them. That's all I'm asking. Nadia left the office at 7:15 and drove to Hargrove Medical Center because she had a shift at 8, and she was not going to miss it. She was aware driving that this was a particular kind of stubbornness, not irrational but not entirely rational either. It was the stubbornness of someone who had decided a long time ago that the things she did on her own terms were not things she was prepared to have taken from her by other people's actions. She showed up because showing up was hers. Nobody was going to make it not be hers. The hospital parking structure was the same as it always was. The elevator had the same slow response. The locker room smelled the same. She changed into fresh scrubs and plaid trudged to her collar and checked her reflection, briefly dark circles, a bruise on her wrist that had deepened overnight from yellow-green to a more deliberate purple, the set of her jaw that people who worked with her recognized as her working face. She went to the trauma floor. Her colleague Amara Sase was handing off the night shift when Nadia came through the doors. Amara looked at her for 1 second with an expression that contained several things simultaneously: relief, something protective, something that was trying to be neutral and not quite making it. You don't have to be here, Amara said. Yes, I do. Nadia. What have we got? Amara held her gaze for a moment longer, then made the professional decision and shifted. Cut 3. Post-op abdomen flagged for infection risk this morning, doctor. Vashti wants eyes on it every 90 minutes. Cut 7. Pediatric head trauma. Have been in since 4 a.m. Is stable, but they need check-ins. 2 has been a revolving door since 6. I've got 3 and 7. I'll cover Bay 2 after I assess you, sure, and Amara. Amara handed her the tablet. Nadia walked. 5. The floor had a particular quality that morning. She noticed it in the first 5 minutes. The way certain people were watching her without watching her. The kind of careful peripheral attention that meant word had moved through the building. A charge nurse near the station gave her a nod that had something deliberate behind it. An orderly. She knew from the first floor held a door for her and said, "Good morning, Sergeant," using the rank, which he had never done before. Let it go. She had patience. At 3 was a 44-year-old woman named Patrice Duval, 2 days post-appendectomy, who had developed a low-grade fever and localized tenderness that was either a standard inflammatory response or the beginning of a wound infection. And the difference between those two things mattered enough that Nadia took 20 minutes to assess thoroughly rather than the 7 minutes the morning schedule technically allocated. She checked the incision, checked the drain output, checked the temperature trend against the last 12 hours of documentation. Asked Patrice the specific questions that patients didn't always think to volunteer answers to. Was the pain sharp or diffuse? Was it worse with movement or constant? Was she getting full breath without discomfort? Patrice said the pain was worse in the last 2 hours and specifically when she breathed deep. Nadia noted it, flagged it for Dr. Vashti, and ordered the additional labs before Vashti had a chance to review the flag. She knew she was right. She also knew she'd have to justify it to Vashti in about 40 minutes when Vashti came on rounds and found the order already in the system. That conversation would be fine. It had been fine before. 7 was a 6-year-old with a skull fracture from a fall, truly a fall. The imaging and the story and the parents' behavior all consistent, a kind of case that made the trauma floor tense. Not because anything was wrong with the parents, but because a child's head fracture was a child's head fracture, and everyone felt the weight of it equally. The parents were a man and a woman who had been awake all night and were in that specific fragile zoltate where they were holding them together through sheer force of the need to be present for their kid. Nadia checked the child, checked the monitors, explained what she was seeing in language that was specific without being either falsely reassuring or unnecessarily alarming, and stayed in the room 3 minutes longer than she needed to clinically because the mother asked her a question that deserved a real answer and not a quick deflection toward the attending. She was coming out of bed 7 when her phone buzzed. Wakeman. She stepped into the corridor. "Talk to me," she said. "The federal investigators made contact this morning, earlier than I expected." Wakeman's voice had the particular tone of someone who was not going to say whether that was good or bad, but wanted the other person to understand it was significant. "They want to interview you in person when," they said today, if possible. "I told them you were working and gave them a window between noon and 2. Fine. Nadia, when I said they made contact earlier than expected, they initiated. I hadn't submitted the full complaint package yet. I'd filed a preliminary notification with supporting documentation. They called me before I'd finished the full submission." She leaned against the corridor wall, which means they already had something. "That's my read." "Yes, on Farwell or on T. On something I don't know about. They didn't share what prompted the early contact, and I didn't ask because that's not the right ask at this stage." A pause. "But someone at the federal level was already watching this department before last night." Nadia. "That thought about that, an active federal interest that predated her traffic stop. Complaint files, the closed ones, going back years. Thread was already in play that had led an investigator to be watching Redmont County for a body camera to catch a deputy calling a Navy Cross a costume piece. That means the footage leaking wasn't a disaster," she said. "It may have actually accelerated a timeline that was already in motion," Wakeman said. "Though I want to be careful about saying that with any confidence. It also means Teague's press conference was a mistake. If he's already under federal scrutiny and he gets up at 5:30 and calls this a misunderstanding, he either doesn't know he's under scrutiny," Wakeman said, "or he knows and calculated that the press conference was better than silence. Either way, he's on record." He, as Nadia checked her watch. She had 4 minutes before she needed to be back on the floor. "I'll be at your office at noon." She went back to work. The next 3 hours ran in the rhythm of trauma nursing, which was not the rhythm of dramatic beats, but the rhythm of continuous assessment and adjustment, checking, documenting, rechecking, translating clinical observations into language that physicians could use and patients can distance between what the data said and what it felt like to be the person the data was about. She was good at this work in a way that had nothing to do with being exceptional and everything to do with having spent years doing it with full attention. There was nothing automatic about how she moved through a floor. She looked at every patient she assessed. She listened when people talked. At 10:40, Dr. Vashti came to find her about the Duval labs. Vashti was 60, Kenyan-born, trained at 2 of the most demanding programs on the East Coast, and had the particular confidence of a physician who had been in medicine long enough to have developed preferences about everything, including which nurses she trusted to initiate orders without her explicit direction. She had not always been enthusiastic about Nadia's tendency to move ahead of authorization. This morning she came to the nursing station with the lab results on her tablet and her expression calibrated to professional neutral. "Culture came back," Vashti said early for culture. "Expedited. Based on your flag," she turned the tablet so Nadia could see. "Staph colonization. Not yet full infection. If we hadn't caught it at 6 hours, we'd be looking at a very different conversation by this evening." Nadia looked at the results she'd known. With certainty. Clinical medicine didn't work on certainty, but with the weight of accumulated pattern recognition that came from years of watching how bodies responded and what it looked like when the response was going wrong. "What's the intervention?" she asked. "I'm adjusting the antibiotic protocol now." "You were right to order the additional panel." Vashti paused, which was not a common event. "You were right to be here this morning." Nadia looked at her. "I saw the footage," Vashti said. "Last night, before I came on shift." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the tablet. My first year of residency, someone reported a car suspicious in the hospital parking structure. The car was mine. I had driven a department attending to a conference that afternoon, and he had parked in a different spot, and I had parked in his spot without knowing. She clicked the tablet off. The point I am making is that I know something about what it costs to be precise and composed in a room where the expectation is that you don't belong. Walked away, before Nadia had to decide what to say back. Nadia stood at the station for a moment, then went to check Bay 2. The federal interview happened in Wakeman's conference room, not a federal building. which was unusual enough that Wakeman explained it without being asked. The investigators had offered to conduct it on neutral ground as a professional courtesy, and Wakeman had accepted. There were two of them, a woman named Agent Dara Okonkwo, who was Civil Rights Division, and a man named Agent Philip Sato, who was Financial Crimes. The presence of a financial crimes agent confirmed without anyone saying so what Wakeman had suggested that morning. Nadia gave her account of the previous night for the second time in 12 hours. It was precise, clinical, thorough, and did not editorialize. Okonkwo asked questions that were specific and technical and made clear she had already reviewed the footage multiple times. Sato said almost nothing during the account of the stop itself, but when Nadia finished and Okonkwo said, "Is there anything you want to add?" Sato leaned forward. "Sergeant Osei," he said, "I want to be clear that the inquiry we're conducting extends beyond last night's incident. We are not able to share the specific scope with you at this stage. But I want to ask you directly in your prior interactions with the Redmond County Sheriff's Office, including during your years at Hargrove Medical. Have you had any other contact with Deputy Merck, Deputy Pruitt, Sheriff Teague, or anyone you know to be associated with the county administrator's office?" She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. "Last night was the first time I'd had contact with any of them." "To your knowledge," Sato said carefully, "has anyone at Hargrove Medical Center had any official interaction with the county administrator's office involving law enforcement coordination contracts, policy agreements, anything of that nature?" "Wakeman," said Agent Sato, "if you're asking my client to speak to hospital administration matters." "I'm asking if she has personal knowledge," he said. "Mind asking her to speculate," Nadia said. "I don't have personal knowledge of any such interaction. I'm hearing what you're asking." "What am I asking?" he said. "Nice. You're asking whether the network is wider than the sheriff's department and the county administrator." "You're asking whether the mechanism has other connections." She held his eye. "And you already think it does?" Sato didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it either, and the shape of what he didn't say sat in the room with the same weight as a direct answer. After the agents left, Wakeman and Nadia sat in the conference room and were quiet for a moment. Wakeman said, "Financial crimes. Yes, if they're here, this isn't just misconduct anymore." "I know," Nadia said. "It isn't." Wakeman put her pen down. I need to expand the scope of your representation. What I've been doing is civil rights litigation work. This is starting to look like requires criminal defense capability. If the investigation's pulling at threads that connect to organizations you've had any association with, I haven't done anything wrong." "I know that's not what I mean." Wakeman's voice was careful and precise. "When federal investigations expand, they pull in people tangentially. I need to make sure you're protected structurally, not just factually." Nadia understood. "Do what you need to do." She was back at Hargrove for the afternoon portion of her shift by 2:15. The floor was in one of its unpredictable medium-show states, not a full crisis, but two cases escalating simultaneously and a bed shortage that was backing up the bay. She folded back into it without transition the way she always did, the way she'd learned to move between high stakes and clinical stakes without losing the thread of either. At 4 p.m., Amara found her in the corridor outside the supply room. "There's something on the news you need to know about," Amenza said, and her voice had a quality that made Nadia stop. The break room TV was on, which it usually wasn't. 3 nurses and a resident were watching on screen. A news anchor was cutting to footage from what appeared to be a county building, the exterior of the municipal center on Crestview, a kind of gray institutional building that exists in every mid-sized American city and is notable only when something is happening inside it. At the bottom of the screen read, "Redmond County Sheriff Teague, reported absent from office department, confirms no official statement." That. In smaller text, "Sources indicate federal activity at county administrator's office this afternoon." The resident said quietly. "What does that mean?" Nobody answered immediately. Nadia stood in the break room doorway with her tablet in her hand and watched the live shot of the county building where 2 unmarked vehicles were parked on the restricted side of the entrance, and a third vehicle was pulling in while the camera was still rolling. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a number she didn't recognize, a 202 area code, which was Washington. Athens. She answered it. The voice on the other end was a woman, professionally measured, identifying herself as a communications director for a federal office she named in full once and did not repeat. "Sergeant Osei," she said. "I want to let you know, before this becomes public in the next 60 minutes, that a federal arrest warrant has been executed this afternoon for County Administrator's Office Deputy Director Douglas Farwell. A second warrant has been issued for Sheriff Malcolm Teague. The charges include conspiracies to obstruct civil rights complaints, misuse of public funds, and federal contracting fraud. Nadia was still looking at the TV screen. On screen, a fourth vehicle turned into the county building entrance. I'm also calling, the woman continued, because in approximately 45 minutes there will be a press statement from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Your name will be mentioned as the individual whose stop precipitated the investigation's escalation to active prosecution. We wanted you to have that information before the statement goes out. Thank you, Nadia said. Is there anything you want to communicate through official channels before the statement? Nadia thought about it. She thought about the 14 names in the closed complaint files. She thought about Pruitt closing the silver case against the rain. She thought about Teague at his 5:30 press conference calling a Navy Cross a costume piece, stop a misunderstanding. Yes, she said, tell them I want the 14 prior complainants notified directly by name before the press statement goes public. Not after. Before they were there before I was, and they deserve to know what happened before the story becomes about something else. There was a pause. I'll communicate that, the woman said. Nadia hung up on the TV screen. The camera had zoomed in on the entrance of the county building, and the Chiron had changed. Athens. Now breaking federal agents enter Redmont County Admin Building, Oz said from beside her. Nadia. I know, Nadia said. I don't know yet, she said. Give me a minute. She walked to the window at the end of the corridor, the one that faced west toward the part of the city she couldn't see from here but could navigate from memory. Well Heights and Sycamore Branch Road and the stretch of wet pavement where she'd put her hands on the hood of her own car and breathed through her teeth and done the math on what fighting looked like versus what waiting looked like. She looked out the window and pressed her bruised wrist gently against the cool glass. 45 minutes, until the U.S. Attorney's statement. And somewhere on the other side of the city, in a building she'd never been inside, Roland Merck was sitting in a room finding out that the mechanism that had protected him had just been disassembled, and that the woman he'd looked at on a rainy road in Caldwell Heights and decided he could read in 10 seconds had been the entire time, something he had no instruments to measure. Picture. Went off Bay 2 incoming trauma. She turned away from the window and walked back down the hall. The trauma that came through Bay 2 was a 47-year-old man named Gerald Ostroff, who had come off a construction scaffold on the south side 3 stories. Partial fall, arrest by a safety line that had caught him around the torso and stopped him from hitting the ground, but had done its own damage in the process. He came unconscious and combative from pain, blood pressure elevated, breathing shallow on the right side. And the mechanism of injury was specific enough that Nadia had her index of suspicion in place before the paramedics finished their handoff report. Pneumothorax, possibly hemothorax. The safety line had arrested the fall and cracked at least 2 ribs in the process, and one of them had likely punched into the pleural space. She worked the assessment in the ordered rapid sequence she'd been doing since her first trauma rotation: airway, breathing, circulation, a triangle of immediate priority that didn't change, regardless of how loud the room was or how much the patient was fighting her. Ostroff was fighting her. He grabbed her arm when she pressed on his right chest and said something that was mostly profanity and partly coherent. I hear you, she said. You've got a broken rib and it may have nicked your lung. I need you to stop grabbing me so I can figure out how bad it is. Let go. Barely she got the imaging ordered and was talking to the attending on-call doctor, Ives, when her phone buzzed again, Wakeman this time, and she sent it to voicemail because Ostroff's oxygen saturation had just dropped 2 points, and that was the conversation that mattered right now. The next 40 minutes were the kind that erased everything external. Ostroff had a moderate hemothorax, blood pooling in the pleural cavity, compressing the lung from outside, and Reeves made the call to place a chest tube, which was not a subtle procedure and which Ostroff did not accept quietly. Nadia managed the sedation protocol, the sterile field, the monitoring of the drain output, as it ran dark, then darker, then leveling off in a way that indicated they'd caught it before it became a surgical emergency. Documented. Every step. She talked to Ostroff's wife, who had arrived from the job site still in the clothes she'd been gardening in when she got the call, and who was in the waiting area doing the specific stillness of someone who has decided that if she sits very carefully, nothing worse will happen. Nadia sat with her for 6 minutes, not because 6 minutes fixed anything, because the woman had asked her a direct question, is he going to be all right, and deserved a direct answer that wasn't either a false reassurance or a hedge so large it communicated nothing. Like the tube is draining. Well, Nadia said his pressure is stabilizing. He's going to be uncomfortable for several days, and he'll need monitoring, but what I'm seeing right now is moving in the right direction. The woman pressed her lips together and nodded and said, thank you for telling me that straight. Of course, she went back to the floor. It was 5:50 when she finally checked her voicemail. Aikman's message was 6 sentences, and the 6th one was the one that reconfigured the shape of the day. 5. The U.S. Attorney's Office delayed the press statement. Teague's attorney filed an emergency injunction. It's been denied, but the delay means the statement goes out tomorrow morning instead of tonight. Hans, call me when you're out, Nadia called her. What was the basis for the injunction? She said, walking toward the stairwell where it was quieter. Teague's attorney argued that the premature release of the press statement would prejudice the jury pool and violate his client's right to a fair process. Aikman's voice was the particular flat tone she used when something had annoyed her professionally, but she wasn't going to let it affect her analysis. Argument is standard, and the denial was appropriate. But it bought him roughly 14 hours. 14 hours for what? That's the question. His attorney is very good. She doesn't file motions that are only about the stated purpose. The injunction attempt created a legal record of objection which has some downstream value in an appeal context, but also created a news story, Teague fights press release, which runs tonight instead of the actual charges, which runs tomorrow. Nadia leaned against the stairwell wall. The concrete was cold through her scrubs. He's still trying to manage the narrative. He's trying to survive it. There's a difference, Wakeman paused. I want you to understand what tomorrow looks like. The statement names him specifically. It outlines the charges. A financial fraud component involves a significant amount of public money, closer to $2 million over 7 years than anyone publicly knew. The press is going to want you. I know, they're going to want a statement, an interview, a presence. Your attorney's advice is to say nothing on the record until after the arraignment. My advice is the same. I wasn't going to, I know you weren't. I'm saying it anyway. Sometimes people wake up at 6 in the morning and there are cameras outside, and it feels like the silence is losing ground to the noise, and they say something. I'm not going to say something good. A pause that had something in it. Nadia, how are you doing? The question was simple, and Wakeman asked it in a different register than she used for everything else, not the attorney register, not the tactical register. Just a direct question. I don't know yet, Nadia said. I keep not having time to figure that out. You should make some time for it eventually. I will. She looked up the stairwell, the gray concrete going up 4 flights in a square spiral. Not tonight. She went home at 7:30. Holt had texted at some point during the afternoon. Saw the news. All when you can. She called him from her car in the hospital parking structure, the engine running, the garage quiet around her. He answered on the second ring. How'd you hold up today? He said. I worked a shift. I gave 2 interviews to federal agents. I watched the news change shape 4 different times. She exhaled. I'm tired. I know you are. What's the temperature from your end? He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was deciding what level of detail was useful. The Veterans Advocacy Coalition put out a statement today supporting you and calling for an independent review of all veteran-related contact with the Redmont County Department. 3 congressional offices have contacted my office asking for briefings. And the Marine Corps Association sent a formal letter to the U.S. Attorney's Office requesting to be kept apprised of proceedings that involved the disrespect of military honors. He paused. That last one surprised me. They move slowly, usually. She said. Yes, the clip, the 11 seconds. A costume piece comment. She'd watched it herself once on Amara's phone during a break and had felt something complicated. watching it not the expected anger which was there, but also a strange detachment. The way you feel watching footage of yourself doing something you remember differently from the inside. On camera, she looked smaller than she felt from inside the memory. She looked like someone who was working very hard to stay still. The clip is doing something useful and something not useful simultaneously, she said. It's making it personal when it needs to stay structural. But the structural case is what Wakeman and the federal attorneys are building. The personal is what got people to look. She thought about that. Wasn't wrong. She just didn't like the mechanism. She said, you knew this was going to become big before I did. I had a sense when you drove me home this morning. I already knew what the scale might be. He was quiet again. I had information that suggested the Redmont department had been on someone's radar at the federal level. Not specifically Teague. Not specifically the financial layer. But I knew the stop wasn't going to stay local. You could have told me that. At 4 in the morning, after you'd been held in a station for 3 hours, I thought you'd had enough information for one night. She didn't argue with that. She sat with it for a moment. Okay, she said, okay. I'm not angry. I just wanted to know if my read of the morning was right. She drove home. The news that night was noise. She moved through without stopping. She ate a real meal for the first time in over 30 hours, eggs and toast, not particularly inspired. Hot and present, and sat at her kitchen table, and did not watch the television, and did not read the coverage, and did not answer the 3 numbers she didn't recognize that called within an hour of her getting home. She checked Wakeman's messages once, confirmed there was nothing requiring immediate action, and went to bed at 9:15. She slept for 7 hours without dreaming, which was unusual for her, and woke up to a morning that had already started without her. The U.S. Attorney's statement had gone out at 7 a.m. At the time, she read it at 7:43, sitting at her kitchen table with her second cup of coffee. It had been picked up by every major outlet. The statement was 15 paragraphs, formal in structure, specific in its claims. Teague and Farwell were named, charged, and described in the careful legal language of a document designed to be airtight before it went public. The financial fraud component was laid out in summary. County contracting irregularities, spanning 6 years, approximately $1.9 million in misdirected public funds, a pattern of complaint suppression, connected to the protection of a specific deputy whose continued employment shielded an ongoing mutual benefit arrangement. X name appeared 7 times in the statement, as the instrument, as the evidence, as the mechanism of harm made possible by the network above him. Her own name appeared twice, once in the description of the precipitating incident, and once in a line near the end that read, the investigation's acceleration to active prosecution was substantially enabled by evidence gathered during a traffic stop of U.S. Navy Sergeant Nadia Osei, whose documented service record and the footage of the incident brought the pattern of conduct to immediate public and federal attention. She read that line twice, then she put the phone face down on the table and finished her coffee. She had a shift at noon. She had 4 hours. She used the first hour to call Wakeman, who had been awake since 5 and sounded like it, but was functioning at full professional capacity regardless. Wakeman walked her through the statement's implications, the likely timeline for arraignment, and the civil case that was now building in parallel, the wrongful arrest component, the unlawful search, the civil rights claim that would move through a separate track from the criminal prosecution. There's something else, Wakeman said. There's always something else. 3 of the 14 prior complainants have made contact. Through the notification process, you requested 2 of them want to be included in the civil action. One of them has an attorney who reached out to my office this morning. Nadia was quiet for a moment. That's good, she said. It is, and it complicates my caseload significantly. But yes, Wakeman's voice had the slight quality of someone who was taking on more than she'd anticipated and had already decided to carry it. I'm bringing in a second attorney from my network, and I trust. She focuses on aggregate civil rights litigation, and she's been following this case since the footage went public. You're sure about her? I've tried 2 cases with her. She doesn't overreach and she doesn't fold a pause. Her name is Renata Mbeki. She's going to want to meet you. Cut it up. The second hour she spent on a call she'd been putting off her mother in Raleigh, who had been texting since the day before, in the way her mother texted, which was in complete paragraphs with punctuation, which meant she was either very calm or had gone past anxiety into something quieter and more deliberate. Nadia called her. Her mother's name was Yvette, and she had been a public school administrator for 30 years. And she had the particular combination of directness and emotional precision that Nadia had grown up thinking was just how people talked until she got into the world and discovered it was specific to her mother and people who had spent decades managing situations that required both care and clarity simultaneously. You could have called sooner, her mother said. I know. I'm sorry. Are you hurt? Bruised wrist, nothing else. It's not nothing. It's not serious. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Hines, your father watched the footage last night. He didn't say very much. You know how he is, I know. He said you looked like yourself. Nadia felt something move through her chest that she didn't have an immediate word for. That's yeah, I told him that was the whole point. That you looked like yourself because you were yourself, and you decided to be in that situation, and that's not a small thing. I'm not going to apologize for understanding what my daughter did. Laughed. Not quite, I know. When is this over? Arraignment will be weeks. Trial could be a year or more. The civil case runs on a different soul. I meant, when is it over for you? Do you get to stop being in it? Nadia looked at the wall. It was a fair question, and she didn't have a clean answer. I don't know yet. Okay, her mother said in the tone that meant she'd filed the answer and would come back to it. You're going to eat real food. I ate eggs this morning. That's a start, and not a destination. Real food. Yes, ma'am. She got to Hargrove at 11:40 and was handed a floor that was in one of its slow-medium states, not quiet, never entirely quiet, but manageable in a way that allowed for actual thought between assessments. She checked in on Ostroff, who was awake and less combative and had graduated to being annoyed about the chest tubes in the specific way that meant his pain was manageable enough to have opinions. She updated his chart, communicated with Reeves about the morning drain numbers, and told Ostroff that the tube would likely come out in another 24 hours if the output kept trending where it was. I nursed from yesterday, he said. Yes, you were on the news. I looked at him. My wife had it on her phone in the morning, he said. When she came in, he shifted carefully, wincing. Your medal they were showing. Yes, he was quiet for a moment. He had a large square face and the specific muscle development of a man who'd worked construction for a long time, and the expression on it was not what she'd expected, not pity, not the performed admiration that sometimes made her uncomfortable, but something more considered. I used to know a guy, he said, Vietnam. He didn't talk about what he did over there. I didn't ask. But when somebody said something stupid about veterans not deserving benefits, he looked at them a certain way. He paused. You've got that same look. What like? You know things you didn't choose to know and you're carrying them anyway. She looked at him for a moment. Get some rest, Mr. Ostroff. Yes, ma'am, he said, with the same cadence her mother used, which he chose not to think about. Afternoon moved. At 2:15, Amara found her with a look that had become the specific look of there's something and I don't know how to lead with it. Huck is here. Amara said Nadia went still in the building. Up to our waiting room. He's there as a patient. He came in through the front. He's not in custody. He's on administrative leave, and apparently Amara stopped. He's having chest pains. They've got him in triage. Nadia stood very still for a moment. Who's covering triage? Yusuf. Yusuf can handle it, he said, very carefully if there was a different nurse available. Nadia looked at her. He didn't say your name, he said. He wanted someone he hadn't, and I'm quoting, had prior contact with. The room held that for a second. Yusuf can handle it, Nadia said again. Document everything. If Merck has a cardiac event in that waiting room, I want full documentation that he received standard of care attention immediately. Amara nodded. I'm fine. She picked up her tablet. Get me the update on bed. Sick, she was not fine in the absolute sense, but she was functional, which was what the floor needed and what she could provide. Life. She managed the specific situation by staying on the opposite end of the department, which was a choice she made consciously. And without shame, she was a professional, not a machine. And managing her own limitations was part of the job. TRID results came back through the system an hour later. Elevated blood pressure, stress-induced arrhythmia, no acute cardiac event. He was treated, observed for 2 hours, and discharged with a referral to a cardiologist and paperwork in his hands that would be documented in his medical record as a matter of routine. The building at 4:30. She noted the timestamp in her own mind and let it go. She didn't let go what stayed with her through the rest of the shift and into the drive home, and the dinner she made herself eat because she wasn't going to fail. That was the specific image of Merkin. The waiting room, having chest pains on the day the U.S. attorney charged the 2 people who had been protecting him for 6 years. She didn't feel sorry for him. She wasn't sure what she felt. It wasn't the satisfaction she might have expected. It was something more complicated, something that had to do with the fact that consequences, when they arrived, rarely looked the way you imagined them in the abstract. They were usually messy, more humans clean. Wakeman called it 6. I need to tell you something before it reaches you another way, she said. Okay. Merck's attorney reached out to the U.S. Attorney's office today. Merck is willing to cooperate. Cooperation. Testimony against Teague and Farwell, corroboration of the complaint suppression mechanism, documentation of what he knew and when. Wakeman paused. In exchange for a reduced charge on the civil rights violation. Demeanor. Rather than felony potential for no custodial sentence. Nadia set down her fork. He was the instrument, she said. Us. He did the stop the false reports. He's the one who put the cuffs on, yes. And his testimony may be the clearest path to making the Farwell-Teague connection provable beyond reasonable doubt in a criminal trial rather than just documentable in civil proceedings. She pressed the heel of her hand against the table. The bruise on her wrist had faded to yellow-green now, 3 days old, still tender at the center. Do the investigators want, she said. They haven't asked for your position on the cooperation deal. Legally, they don't need it. I'm telling you as a matter of professional courtesy, and because I think you should know. What do you think? Wakeman was quiet for a moment. I think that the criminal accountability for Teague and Farwell matters. I think a conviction that holds on appeal matters more than a maximum charge that gets reduced in post-trial proceedings. I think Merck walking away with a misdemeanor is going to be legitimately infuriating to the 14 people who filed complaints against him, and I think that infuriation is entirely justified. She paused. And I think you asked me what I think, so I'm telling you. The deal, if accepted, strengthens the structural case and weakens the personal accountability case. Those 2 things are both true at the same time. Nadia was quiet for a long moment. 14 complainants, she said. Renata and Becky's aggregate civil action. Does Merck's cooperation affect the civil track? No. The civil case runs independently. Whatever happens in the criminal proceeding, the civil liability stands. So whatever reduced sentence he negotiates, he still faces civil judgment. That's a different proceeding with different standards of proof and different remedies. She picked up her fork again. Okay, that's all. That's all. She ate. She thought about the 14 names, people she'd never met, who had sat in rooms like the one she'd sat in and spoken into complaint forms that disappeared into an administrative pathway that ended at Teague's desk. She thought about the mechanism, not Merck, not Teague, but the mechanism, the specific architecture of closed files and informal reroutes, and a county administrator's office communicating in careful language about standard pathways. She thought about the fact that she had not created the case against that mechanism. It had existed before she drove through Caldwell Heights. The federal investigators had been watching something quietly before the footage of 11 seconds went everywhere. She had been the moment it became visible. That was different from being the cause. She was trying to keep that distinction clear. The next morning, 4 days after the stop, the world now thoroughly different in shape. She was in Wakeman's office for a scheduled meeting with Renata Mbeki, who turned out to be exactly what Wakeman had described. A woman in her late 40s with the energy of someone who had been doing this work long enough to have shed all the performance of it and kept only the function. She shook Nadia's hand, sat down, and within 3 minutes had asked the four most structurally important questions about the civil case in a sequence that suggested she'd been thinking about it for days. They were halfway through the meeting when Wakeman's paralegal Doss knocked and opened the door. "I'm sorry," he said. "There's something on the news." He had his phone on the screen. A breaking Chiron, former Redmont County Sheriff Teague makes statement, claims federal investigation politically motivated. The Chiron, Teague himself standing outside what appeared to be his attorney's office on a street Nadia recognized as downtown Morrow Falls, a cluster of cameras in front of him, his attorney at his shoulder, his face arranged into the specific expression of a man who had decided that his best remaining move was aggression. He was speaking, the phone had the volume low, but Doss turned it up. What happened to Sergeant Osei was wrong, Teague was saying. Deputy Merck acted outside the bounds of acceptable conduct, and the department has taken appropriate action. What is being done to me and to Doug Farwell is a different matter entirely. This investigation has been politically driven from the beginning, and I intend to demonstrate in court that the evidence being used against us was gathered through a process designed to reach a predetermined conclusion, Wakeman said quietly. He's going to trial, obviously, Mbeki said without looking up from her notes. He's framing himself as the secondary victim of the Merck story, Nadia said. Yes, the 14 complainants are still invisible in that framing. Yes, what does Mbeki's aggregate filing do to that? He looked up now. It makes them visible by name, by incident, by documented harm. It puts them in the record alongside your case in a way that makes it structurally impossible for the narrative to stay focused on the Merck incident as an isolated event. Nadia looked at the phone screen. Teague was still speaking, his attorney occasionally leaning toward him to say something inaudible. He looked like a man who was fighting, which meant he still thought there was something to fight for, which meant the net wasn't fully closed yet. Fine. When does the aggregate filing go in? She said 2 weeks. Mbeki said, I need that time to make it airtight. Can you do it in 10 days? He looked at her steadily. Why 10 days? Because in 10 days, Merck's cooperation deal either closes or falls through. If it closes, his attorney is going to argue that the cooperation demonstrates the department has already taken accountability and that additional civil action is punitive rather than remedial. She paused. If the aggregate filing is already in the record before the deal closes, that argument is weaker. Mbeki and Wakeman looked at each other. Mbeki said, "You've been thinking about this." "I've had time between patients." Mbeki picked up her pen. "It is tight, I know. I'll need everything you have. All documentation. All 14 complainant contacts. Everything, Wakeman, it's yours." Mbeki nodded. Something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but a slight recalibration. The look of someone who had reassessed the room they were in. "On days," she said. They finished the meeting at 11:15. Nadia was due at Hargrove at noon. She was standing in the elevator when Wakeman's number appeared on her screen. "Just saw it," she said, Teague's statement. "Not that," Wakeman said. "Something else." Her voice had the particular weight of a sentence being carried carefully. Us was doing a final cross-check on the evidence files. He found a document we didn't have before it came through the federal discovery release this morning, buried in a batch of administrative correspondence. Document. An email from 14 months ago, from Farwell's county account. Wakeman paused. It's addressed to the Human Resources Director at Hargrove Medical Center. A moment. "What does it say?" she said. It's phrased carefully the way all his communications are. In substance, he was asking whether the hospital had any mechanism for flagging employees who generated repeated police contact, and whether that flag could be considered in scheduling and credential review decisions. Elevator reached the ground floor and opened. Nadia stood in it, without moving, one hand on the door to hold it open. He was trying to reach into my workplace, she said. 18 months ago. Before last week, before the stop. Wakeman's voice was careful and precise. Which means he either had specific knowledge of you, or he was conducting a broader sweep of individuals who'd had contact with the department, looking for leverage points in their professional lives. Nadia thought about the closed complaint files, about the 14 names, how long the mechanism had been running. Did HR respond, she said. Wakeman was quiet for one beat too. Yes, she said. It did. The elevator doors tried to close, and she held them open with her forearm and stood there while Wakeman's words settled into something she could examine clearly. It responded. She said, "What did they say?" The response was cautious. At HR language. They cited employee privacy policy, said they didn't have a mechanism for the kind of flagging Farwell described, and declined to engage further. Wakeman paused. But Nadia, they received the email, they read it. And there is no record in your personnel file of that email ever being reported to hospital administration, to legal, or to you. Let the elevator go. It slid closed beside her, and she stood in the lobby of Wakeman's building, with people moving past her on their way out to the street, the ordinary mid-morning traffic of a workday. Someone in HR got an email from a county official asking how to use my job against me, she said, and didn't tell me. 18 months ago. And nobody said anything. The HR director at the time was a woman named Patricia Sorrell. She retired 8 months ago. Her successor has been in the role since January. Wakeman's voice was level but had a careful undertone. I don't know yet whether Sorrell made a deliberate decision to suppress it, or whether she genuinely didn't know what to do with it and chose the path of least confrontation. That distinction matters legally. It matters to me for other reasons too, Nadia said. I know. She stood still for another moment, then walked out the front door onto Creston Avenue. The morning was cold and clear, that had no ambiguity in it. Sharp light, hard shadows, the city in full daylight doing nothing to soften anything. She thought about 14 months ago. She'd been on the trauma floor working, doing what she always did. Somewhere in the hospital's administrative wing, someone had opened an email from Douglas Farwell asking how to reach into her professional life and compromise it, and had read it, and had chosen to say nothing. Not to her, not to anyone. The mechanism hadn't been limited to the sheriff's department. It had felt around the edges of the places she existed and looked for the soft spots. And it had been doing that while she was carrying patients through a shift and going home tired and taking the same cut-through on Sycamore Branch, because it saved 8 minutes, and she never thought she needed to account for herself to anyone on that road. She called Holt. He answered on the first ring. I need to ask you something, she said. Ask. When you knew the department was under federal scrutiny last week, did that scrutiny include anything connected to hospital employees or county institutions outside law enforcement? There was a pause that was 2 seconds long, which from Holt was significant. Why are you asking? He said. Because I just found out that a county official contacted Hargrove HR 14 months ago, me asking them to flag my employment status in connection with police contact. HR received it and said nothing. Holt's pause this time was 3 seconds. Oh, he said. What I knew was specific to the department's complaint suppression pattern, not external reach. He paused again, but if Farwell was contacting hospitals, then it may not have just been hospitals, she said. No, he said slowly. It may not have been. She told him she'd call back later, and up and stood on the sidewalk and made herself think it through without the noise of reaction. Well, had been the network's administrative layer. His function had been to manage which complaints disappeared and to ensure the financial arrangement between the department contracts and his brother-in-law's company continued without scrutiny. Reaching into employment records was an extension of that function, identifying people who might become problems and looking for professional leverage before they became problems publicly, which meant the 14 complainants might not have been the extent of his external reach, which meant there might be other people in other workplaces who had received similar inquiries and made similar decisions about whether to say anything. Wakeman back the HR email, she said. I need you to find out whether Farwell's county email account sent similar inquiries to any other institutions. Employers, hospitals, schools, anywhere that prior complainants worked. Hickman was quiet for a moment. That's in the federal discovery material. Yes, I don't control what they prioritize, I know. But you can ask in Renata Mbecki's aggregate filing if there are employment effects on prior complainants that changes the damages calculation significantly. Yes. Wakeman said it does another pause. I'll reach out to Okonkwo today. Nadia went to work. She worked her shift with the specific focus she'd been using all week to keep the external from swamping the present. The technique she'd developed in situations where the psychological and the immediate had to coexist without one compromising the other. She assessed patients, she documented, she communicated, she made the 40 small decisions that trauma nursing required per hour and made most of them correctly, and caught the ones she didn't immediately. She checked on Ostroff, whose chest tube had come out that morning, and who was sitting up in bed looking dramatically more like a person. She passed Merck's triage documentation to the records department without looking at it more than professionally necessary. She ate lunch sitting down, which she did not always manage. At 3 p.m., Agent Okonkwo called her directly for the first time. Sergeant Osei, she said, I want to update you on something that I think you have a right to know about before it becomes part of the public record. Okay. We've been reviewing Farwell's county email account as part of the financial fraud investigation. The scope of his external communications was broader than we initially assessed. A pause. He contacted 11 institutions over a period of 3 years. 7 of them were employers of individuals who had filed complaints against Deputy Merck. The other 4 were employers of individuals who had attended a public meeting where the Redmont Department's use of force policies were discussed critically. Another pause. Grove. Medical was on the list. You were specifically named in the email. Nadia kept her voice level. What was the response rate? The 11 institutions contacted. 4 responded in some capacity. 3 of those responses were in the same register as Hargrove's declining to engage but not reporting the inquiry. An employer. A private security firm responded with scheduling information for the employee in question. She closed her eyes for 1 second. Who was the employee, she said. A man named Terrell Bates. He filed a complaint against Merck 2 years ago. Within 3 months of the employer's response to Farwell, his hours were reduced and he was subsequently let go. Okonkwo's voice was careful and precise. We don't have direct evidence yet that the termination was directed by Farwell. But the timeline is specific enough that it's a priority investigative thread. Nadia stood in the corridor outside the supply room, the same place she'd been standing when Amara had told her Merck was in the building. The corridor was quiet. Someone had propped the supply room door open with a box of gloves. She thought about Terrell Bates. She didn't know him. She knew his name now from a complaint file, a number and a pattern. He had filed a complaint and lost his hours and then his job, and somewhere in between, a county administrator had contacted his employer and an HR person had decided what to do with that contact and had chosen a door. Is Bates being contacted? She said. We reached out yesterday. He's agreed to speak with investigators. Is he part of Mbecki's civil action? I can't speak to. That's outside my jurisdiction. I understand. Thank you for calling me directly. You asked us to tell you things before they became public, Okonkwo said. I'm trying to honor that, I know. I appreciate it. She called Wakeman, gave her Terrell Bates's name, and went back to her patients. The next 9 days were the most procedurally dense of her life, which was saying something for a person who had served in a combat theater. The federal investigation operated on its own timeline and shared information with her only through Okonkwo's careful periodic calls and through the discovery materials that flowed to Wakeman and Mbecki. The civil case was being built in documents and declarations and evidence packets that Mbecki assembled with an efficiency that Nadia found genuinely impressive. The criminal proceedings moved in the slow, weighted way of federal criminal proceedings, each step deliberate. Each document filed and cross-filed and responded to and re-responded to. To work. She came home. She ate real food as instructed. She called her mother 3 times, her father once a shorter call, mostly him asking how she was sleeping and her telling him fine, and him not quite believing her but accepting it because that was how they operated. 5. She met with Holt twice in person, once for coffee that was nominally personal and mostly strategic, and once his Arlington office, where he'd assembled a small group of veterans advocacy leaders who wanted to hear directly from her about what had happened and what she needed. 5. She told them what she needed was cystic, not personal. 5. She wanted the oversight structure changed. She wanted an independent review board for law enforcement misconduct that had no reporting line to the entity being reviewed. She wanted a mechanism that protected complainants' employment from retaliation, documented, enforceable with real consequences. She wanted the 14 people in those complaint files to have something concrete come out of this beyond a press statement. Of the advocacy leaders, a man named Weston Garr, who had spent 20 years working veterans legislative policy, said, "What you're describing is a legislative ask." "I know it is. You'd have to be willing to go to Washington." Looked at him. "I'm willing to go to Washington." Fire. Looked at Holt. Holt said nothing, but his expression said something. The way his expressions generally communicated more than his words when he chose to let them. The arraignment for Teague and Farwell was on a Thursday morning in federal court in the district capital from Morrow Falls. She wasn't required to Wakeman and sat in the gallery in civilian clothes and watched the proceeding with the same focused, contained attention she brought to anything she needed to fully understand. Teague pleaded not guilty, so did Farwell. Their attorneys made the expected arguments about the politically motivated nature of the investigation, the insufficiency of the evidence, the prejudicial effect of the media coverage. Judge, a woman in her 60s, with the energy of someone who had been hearing these arguments for 30 years and had precise opinions about their validity, noted the pleas, set the preliminary hearing schedule, and moved through the proceeding with a brisk efficiency that left very little room for theater. Buck's cooperation deal had closed 4 days earlier. He had pleaded guilty to 2 misdemeanor counts, unlawful search and filing a false official report, and agreed to full cooperation with the prosecution of Teague and Farwell. His testimony, Okonkwo had told Wakeman, was specific and detailed and corroborated by documentary evidence in a way that made it substantially useful. He would serve no custodial sentence. He was permanently barred from law enforcement employment in the state. Civil case against him, the one running through Mbeki's aggregate action, remained pending. He would face it without the protection of any network. Nadia had sat with the cooperation deal for 9 days and had arrived somewhere that wasn't quite peace but was functional. Walking with a misdemeanor was an injustice of a particular shape, small and bounded, and situated inside a larger structure of accountability that was still unfolding, and she had decided to carry it the way you carry things you can't fix. Legit. Don't pretend it isn't there, continue. Aggregate civil filings went in on day 10. Becky filed it on a Tuesday morning, and by afternoon it had been picked up by 4 news outlets that were still tracking the case. 16 names, the 14 prior complainants plus Nadia plus Terrell Bates, consolidated into a single civil action naming Merck, Teague, Farwell, and the Redmont County Sheriff's Office as defendants. 5. The filing included employment retaliation claims, civil rights violations, and a calculation that reflected not just the individual incidents but the systematic nature of the harm. Nadia's phone ran hot for the rest of that day. She let most of it go to Wakeman. Call. She took a woman named Sandra Reyes, one of the 14 complainants who had gotten Nadia's number through the notification process. She called at 7 in the evening, and her voice had the texture of someone who had been deciding whether to make this call for a while. "I just wanted to say thank you," Sandra said. I know that's not why you did it. I know it happened to you because of you specifically, not because of us." She stopped for a moment. "I filed that complaint 2 years ago, and I thought it just disappeared. I thought it went somewhere and nothing happened, and I was just supposed to accept that nothing happened. Now someone with my name on it is in a federal court filing, and I didn't expect that." Nadia was quiet for a moment. She was sitting at her kitchen table again, the silver case on the table in front of her the way it sometimes was in the evenings. Not open, just present. I asked for it, she said. I asked specifically that prior complainants be included before anything else was announced. Eyes. Before the attention moved to something else. Why? Because you were there first, Nadia said, and that mattered. Sandra was quiet for a moment on the other end. I didn't know anyone knew that, she said. Someone should have known it a lot sooner, Nadia said. I'm sorry. It took this long. They talked for another 12 minutes, which was not something Nadia had planned for, and which she made the deliberate choice to give anyway. Because Sandra Reyes had spent 2 years in a condition of unresolved injustice, and a 12-minute phone call from someone who understood what that cost was not a grand gesture. It was just the minimum of what the situation deserved. She hung up and sat in the quiet of her kitchen for a while. Then she opened the silver case and looked at the Navy cross. She'd been carrying it for 6 years, in the bag, always the way some people carry something that keeps them tethered to the most accurate version of themselves, not out of vanity or nostalgia, but because the object marked a moment when everything that mattered about who she was had been tested at full pressure and had not cracked. She didn't need it to know that she knew it without the medal. But the medal was the external record of something she'd chosen to do in a moment when choosing was very hard, and she wasn't ready to leave it behind in a house while she went somewhere else. She looked at it for a long time, then she closed the case. The trial of Malcolm Teague and Douglas Farwell began 7 months later in the same federal court in a March that came in gray and cold, and stayed that way through the first week of proceedings. Nadia testified on the 4th day in the morning session. She wore a dark suit she'd bought specifically for this purpose and had worn once before to a deposition in a different case a year and a half ago. She sat in the witness chair and answered questions for 2 hours and 40 minutes, with the same quality of precision she'd been bringing to every room she'd entered since the night on Sycamore Branch Road. The prosecution's questions built the sequence of events she'd already reconstructed a dozen times in formal settings. She answered them the same way she always had, specific, ordered, unembellished. She didn't perform emotion, she didn't suppress it either. When she talked about the moment, Merck picked up the silver case and made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh. She talked about it in the same register she used for everything else. And the register itself was the thing that mattered, not the content of what she said, but the quality of steadiness with which she said it, which was not armor over something broken, but the actual texture of how she was. Teague's defense attorney was skilled and tried 3 different angles in cross-examination. She questioned the characterization of the complaint closure mechanism, suggesting standard administrative practice rather than deliberate suppression. She questioned whether Farwell's emails could be read as routine inquiry rather than targeted intimidation. She questioned whether the federal investigation's timeline demonstrated that Nadia's stop had been the precipitating factor or merely a convergent event in a pre-existing inquiry. Nadia answered each question directly and without elaboration beyond what was asked. She did not get rattled. She had been in her life in rooms where people were actively trying to kill her. A defense attorney doing her job was not that. After she stepped down, she sat in the gallery for the rest of the morning session and watched Grayson Pruitt take the stand. He'd cooperated from the beginning, as he'd promised in that monitor room off the main floor of the substation. His testimony was thorough and uncomfortable, and visibly cost him something to give. He talked about what he'd seen, what he'd reported, what he'd been told to do with his report, and what he'd done instead. And it had the rough textures of someone owning something that he couldn't make clean by acknowledging it. He didn't try to make it clean, he just answered the questions. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The verdict came back on a Friday afternoon, guilty on all counts. Conspiracy to obstruct civil rights complaints, misuse of public funds, federal contracting fraud. The same plus the additional employment retaliation count connected to Terrell Bates. The counts were specific, documented, and would carry mandatory sentencing guidelines that Wakeman had explained to Nadia in advance with the careful honesty she'd brought to every conversation about realistic outcomes. Like, received 4 years in federal prison, forfeiture of his pension, and a permanent bar from public office. Blackwell received 5 years and 3 months, the additional time for the employment retaliation count, and a civil judgment that included damages to Terrell Bates specifically. Athens. Both men would additionally face the civil claims from Mbecky's aggregate action in separate proceedings. The courtroom was not dramatic when the verdict was read. It rarely was in Nadia's limited experience of verdicts. The judge read the findings. The jury was thanked and released. The attorneys exchanged the procedural words that followed a verdict, and the session ended. 5. Teague's face when the guilty counts were read did what faces do in those moments: a compression, a recalibration, the visible moment of a man understanding that the thing he'd been fighting to prevent had arrived. She watched it without satisfaction and without looking away. Outside, the courthouse stood next to on the steps in the gray March afternoon and said the civil proceedings start in 60 days. I know it's going to be another several months. I know that too. Mbeki looked at her. Gotten to know Nadia in the way that attorneys got to know clients they worked closely with, not personally but accurately, which was its own form of intimacy. How are you actually doing? Better than 6 months ago, Nadia said. It's a relative answer. It's the honest one. Becky, almost fair enough. Civil settlement came 5 months after that. In August, after 4 weeks of mediated negotiation that Nadia was involved in, only as a principal whose attorneys did most of the work and checked in with her at each substantive decision point. The settlement, spread across the 16 complainants in the aggregate action, was the largest civil rights settlement in Redmond County's history. Nadia's individual portion was substantial. Her attorneys had built a strong unlawful detention, unlawful search, like a defamation of service record case, and the number was specific and real and landed in her account on a Wednesday afternoon that was otherwise ordinary in every respect. She sat with it for 2 days. Then she called a lawyer who specialized in nonprofit formation, and she called Holt, and she called her mother, and she had 3 separate conversations that converged on the same place, what the money was for. She kept enough to cover 6 months of living expenses as a buffer and invested a portion in a fund her financial advisor had been recommending for 2 years. The substantial part, the majority, she put into a structure that took 4 months to formalize and required more administrative work than any single thing she'd done outside the military or medicine. The Sycamore Branch Veterans Legal Fund. It was not a medical scholarship, which was what people expected given her profession. It was a legal defense fund specifically structured to provide representation to veterans who experienced civil rights violations and encounters with law enforcement, free legal counsel up front, before they had to navigate a system that assumed they couldn't afford to fight. The initial board included Wakeman, Mbeck, Holt, Weston Garr from the Veterans Advocacy Coalition, and Terrell Bates, who had agreed to serve after a phone call with Nadia that had lasted 45 minutes and covered things neither of them had fully put into words before. First operational quarter provided representation to 9 veterans. 3 of those cases resulted in settlements. 2 resulted in dropped charges. 4 were still in process when the quarter closed. None of it was fast. None of it was clean. None of it resolved the fundamental conditions that made the fund necessary in the first place. That was the thing nobody told you about justice. When you were on the outside of needing it, it didn't close. It opened, it created structure. Where there hadn't been structure, accountability. Where there'd been impunity, visibility. Where there'd been administrative darkness. It didn't erase, it didn't repair, it built something new in the space where the harm had been, and that new thing was imperfect and required maintenance and would be tested again by the next person and the next situation and the next deputy on the next rainy road who decided they could read a room in 10 seconds. She understood that she'd understood it going in. It didn't make the building less necessary. She went back to the trauma floor on the Monday after the fund's incorporation was finalized. She was 4 minutes late because the parking structure elevator was doing the thing it always did, and Amara raised her eyebrow when she came through the doors. Nadia said, "You never oversleep, I'm branching out." Camera handed her the tablet. 3 is flagging bed 7 got discharged this morning. Good news, and Bay 2 has been a situation since 6 a.m. Nadia took the tablet to find situation multi-vehicle on the interstate. Hi. Incoming, she was already moving. The floor absorbed her the way it always did, completely and without ceremony. And she worked the next 7 hours in the rhythm of assessment and intervention and documentation and communication, and the 1,000 small decisions that added up to whether someone went home or didn't. And she made most of them correctly and caught the one she didn't at the 4-hour mark, when a medication interaction she should have flagged earlier came up in a reassessment, and she flagged it then, late but not too late, updated the attending, and wrote an addendum to her own documentation that noted the timing and the correction without minimizing either. She was not a perfect nurse. She had never claimed to be. She was a very good one who paid full attention and made the corrections when they needed making. And that was the thing that actually mattered in the rooms where she worked. At the end of her shift, she went to her locker and changed and picked up her bag with the silver case in the bottom of it and walked out to the parking structure and took the slow elevator to level 3 and got in her car. It was late October again, nearly a year since the stop, the city doing what it did in October, the light going shorter, the evenings coming faster, the particular quality of autumn dark that fell with a kind of weight. She drove out of the parking structure and turned east toward Delhart. She took Sycamore Branch not because she had to, because it was her route, had always been her route, and she was not going to give it to anyone. She drove it at 28 miles per hour with both hands on the wheel and the radio off through the part of Caldwell Heights where the houses sat back from the road with their porch lights on, through the particular stretch of road where her rearview mirror had once filled with rolling red and blue through the intersection. She crossed every time, and which was just an intersection, ordinary asphalt, and painted lines unremarkable except for what she knew about it. She didn't stop. She drove through, continued east, and came out on the far side of the neighborhood the way she always did the road, opening back up onto the longer stretch that led toward home. Her phone rang. She answered it through the car speakers. Nadia Holt's voice, evening register, unhurried. I saw the quarterly report from the fund. 9 cases. 9 cases in the first quarter. It's not nothing. Oh, she said. It's not. He was quiet for a moment. 9. How are you? She thought about it with the specific honesty she'd been trying to bring to that question when people asked it, without performing either reassurance or difficulty. I'm okay, she said. Not fixed, not done processing whatever this year was. Okay in the sense that I got up and went to work and did the work and came home. She paused. That used to feel like not enough. Now I think it might be the whole thing. What do you mean? I mean showing up, not being made smaller by the thing that tried to make you smaller. Not carrying it as the defining event of who you are, but not pretending it didn't happen either. She watched the streetlights begin to appear, the city shifting into its evening mode. I treated patients today. I caught a medication error. I drove home on my own road. That's the whole thing. Was quiet for a long moment, you know, he said, when I wrote your first commendation. I used the phrase uncommon steadiness under conditions designed to break steadiness. I remember. I thought about it again recently. I don't think I had the language right. She glanced at the speaker, which was a pointless gesture when you were on a phone call. What would you change? Steadiness under pressure is a performance. You can be steady and be performing it. What you have isn't that. He paused. It's more like you know what the conditions are trying to do to you, and you choose not to cooperate with them. That's different from steadiness. That's something more intentional. For a moment, I'll use that, she said. Use it for what the legal fund. We're doing a presentation next month for a veterans support network, trying to explain why the fund exists and what it actually does. She paused. I need language for that. You know what the conditions are trying to do to you, he said, and you choose not to cooperate. Yes, she said, that's it. She pulled onto Delhart and found her usual spot in front of the house and sat in the car for a moment after she turned the engine off, the way she sometimes did, not troubled, not avoiding anything, just taking the transition at her own pace. Right. The porch light was on the way it always was when she worked nights. The habit she'd kept from years of different kinds of assignment, meaning something she'd never fully examined and didn't need to. Like, she picked up her bag. She could feel the weight of the silver case at the bottom of it, familiar and specific. Inside. She put the bag on the kitchen table and made tea and stood at the window while it steeped, looking out at the dark street. Somewhere a few miles west, Sycamore Branch Road was the same as it had always been: ordinary pavement, residential, quiet, the houses with their porch lights burning. Intersection where she turned. The stretch where the lights had appeared in her mirror. The wet asphalt where her equipment had been laid out, and the silver case had sat open in the rain until someone chose to close it. She drank her tea. She thought about Sandra Reyes saying, "I thought it just disappeared." Terrell Bates losing his hours, and then his job, the timeline, so specific it was almost mechanical. The 14 names in the closed complaint files, each one a person who had tried the system and found it designed to return nothing. Grayson Pruitt in the monitor room, with his arms crossed, looking at the floor, building toward a decision he'd been postponing for over a year. Plus, people kept asking her what the lesson was. Reporters, advocacy leaders, the Veterans Network people who invited her to speak. The young nurses at Hargrove who came to her with questions that were sometimes about clinical practice and sometimes about something harder. They wanted the lesson distilled to something they could carry. She kept not having a clean answer for them, and she'd decided to stop apologizing for that. The clean answer was dishonest. The real thing was messier and more durable and required you to sit with some discomfort, which was uncomfortable by definition, and that was exactly the point. She said when she spoke was this: systems are built by people and maintained by people and protected by people who have decided that the maintenance costs them less than the accountability would. The only thing that consistently changes those systems is other people deciding that the opposite is true, that the cost of protecting them is higher than the cost of dismantling them. That process is slow and adversarial, and it doesn't always produce the exact justice any individual harmed person deserves. It is not powerless. The people who depend on the system protecting them depend on you believing you are powerless. That was the whole lesson. It fit in 2 sentences, but it took years to mean anything. She finished her tea and washed the cup and turned off the kitchen light. Before she went upstairs, she opened the silver case one more time. She looked at the metal, the anchor, the eagle, the ribbon, still clean after 6 years of being carried in a bag through hospitals and field stations and a holding room in Redmont County and a federal courthouse and every ordinary place in between. She ran her thumb across the face of it the way she sometimes did. Then she closed the case and left it on the kitchen table and went to bed. And the porch light stayed on the way it always did. And the house was quiet, and Sycamore Branch Road was 3 miles west, doing nothing, being a road, ordinary, and unremarkable, belonging to nobody and to everyone, hers as much as anyone's, and she intended to keep it that way. There were 9 veterans being represented through the fund that quarter. Next quarter, there would be more. She set her alarm and closed her eyes. The world she'd come back to was imperfect and resistant and slow, and she was in it with her eyes open, and she was not done.